Welcome everyone to another episode of Everything You Need to Know About Product Marketing Interviews. My name is Kenton Kvestu. I'm your host. I'm the founder and CEO of Rocketblock's online platform that helps candidates prepare for interviews. And today we are lucky to have Grant Shirk with us. He is the head of product marketing at Cisco Meraki, and he is going to be telling us all about product marketing interviews today. So welcome to the show, Grant. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kenton. It's great to be here. How are things going today?
Things are going well. How about on your end?
Doing all right. It's been a hot week here, East Bay, but we might fall below 100 by the weekend. We'll see.
Oof, I hope so. Good luck with that. Triple digits is hot. Before we jump in and talk about interviews and go through everything, tell me a little bit about your product marketing background today. You're running product marketing for a large unit at Cisco, but tell me a little bit about that and how you got to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm relatively new to the Cisco Meraki team, but joined to help drive their product marketing strategy as they look to expand to their next set of customers, new segments and new industries. But prior to Cisco, I've done companies at every size and scale. 10 years ago, I was at Microsoft doing vertical marketing. In between, I've done everything from Box, joining 450 people as we were just starting down the path of enterprise product marketing and carrying that through the IPO. And most recently, I joined Data, which was an Andreessen Horowitz funded company in the data and analytics space. And I joined as the 9th employee and the first and head of marketing. So kind of from 9 to 100,000 in between. But the thing that ties it together has been being a little bit of an enterprise software nerd. I learned early on in my career, back when I was a UI designer at Tell Me Networks, that I really liked learning about how companies like Fidelity Investments and FedEx and American Express operated and the challenges that they were trying to solve. And that kind of set me down this path to begin with.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to jump in and talk all things product marketing interviews with you, given your extensive range of experiences at sort of all company sizes on the spectrum. I'd love to just start with a high level question about what are some of your favorite product marketing questions to ask in interviews? Which questions do you find particularly insightful or revealing, and why are those super helpful?
Sure. The first and most important question that I like to ask and that people should be prepared for is, tell me about your current. It's a great opportunity, one, to open the conversation with something that people are hopefully familiar with. It's also a big sign if they're not speaking at that level. But it also almost sets some common ground in terms of how a candidate is going to talk about her experience and her approach to the product. And I'm listening in that scenario for, is there a structured way that the candidate talks about the messaging? Do they highlight out of the gate who the customer is and why it matters? And then a really, really great answer for that normally will also fill in the problem that they solve. And if I can, so one, it's great because it kind of sets some baseline for the conversation, but then it gives you a lot of great jumping off points. And those are usually my next drop-ins. Well, tell me more about the customer and the problem you're trying to solve. Like, go deeper on that. And then as a follow-up, I almost always will ask to walk through a recent product launch, what works and what didn't. And that will also give me a sense of what model of product marketing they're familiar with, whether they are new in role and they've just observed it happen, or if it's something they've been doing for a while. It kind of shows me what approach they've been steeped in over time.
And does it matter at all if the candidate is someone that's trying to break into product marketing for the first time? Will you tailor those particular questions, or will you expect them to answer it at a different level? How do you approach that?
The expectations are definitely different. I will say that both at companies small and large, I've had some of my greatest successes hiring people who weren't coming directly from 4 or 5 years of product marketing expertise. That might be a small bias that I have. And again, I started off as a UI designer. I spent a couple of years in strategic planning and finance, which is the natural progression.
Exactly.
And then vertical marketing into product marketing.
And I think that breadth of like FP&A all the way over.
It's what everybody does, right? It's the track. But I found that people who have more of a breadth of experience, oftentimes you can learn a product. That's the easy part of the job, but digging into the structure thinking and the breadth of the problem is critical. So for someone new, I'm not expecting them to speak in specific frameworks or be able to break down exactly how a launch went and how they measured it. But if they can get to the level of explaining why a product matters, have a structured answer, and can work with me and dig into why a given customer might or might not care about a value pillar or a message, that's a really good signal. And then I can start testing a PMM without official experience on how they work through some of those challenges, how they work with sales, right? I'll spend some time there, how they work with engineering, how they work with customers, all of those with product marketing at the center of all of that. Those are areas that I'll dig into.
Got it. And you said something at the beginning of the answer, tell me about your product, and you want to see them discuss the messaging around the product, the customer, the problem they're trying to solve. And the word you used was, I want to see sort of how they structure that, or if they structure. Can you tell me a little more about what does it mean to structure, say, how you are talking about the messaging for your product? Because I have some guesses of what you might say there, but I would love to sort of tease that out.
Okay, and then I'd love to come back and say, what were the guesses? Because I'm always trying to see other people's frameworks for this. I think it's really interesting. That's the fun part about product marketing, is there's no real playbook. As you're bringing together these different pieces of customer, market, product, buying cycle, there's so many different ways to put it together. But about structured thinking, can you take a very complex and nuanced discussion and break it down into some format or some set of building blocks that fit into it? Because ultimately, that's what I ask my team to do, and as product marketers, we're called on to do. Take something, break it down into its components so you can scale out messaging, campaigns, broader content themes. And if you can't do that and understand why Kenton is going to care about the simplicity and ease of use of the product, but Kenton's manager is probably going to care more about the security and scale. If you can't explain that very succinctly, it means you're not probably thinking about it all the way through. I will admit it's not, I hate trap questions, but it's a litmus test, because oftentimes you can go there, that conversation goes two ways. You can ask someone about the product and all of a sudden you get features and functionality. That's usually a red flag for me. We need to be above features and functionality and use the features and speeds as proof points and backup to the bigger problem that we're trying to solve.
Yep. Cool. Makes sense.
How did I do against your guess?
Your answer was more thorough than my high-level guess. Also, speaking from the standpoint of not a product marketer, and I'll simplify by, I guess, a level above you was who are the different customer segments, and then basically what are their pain points, and then how are we sort of addressing, what are the messaging to entice them that we are going to solve their pain points. I sort of was off the cuff reaction was, what are those pain points and what are the messages that entice, like convince someone we will be the solution to their pain points. And a nice part you added above was, well, there's different segments, or even if it's the same customer, there's who's buying versus who's using, and the segment of the messaging might matter there and which channels you use. So it's a really interesting question, because to be able to actually talk about messaging, say, for the product in a structured way, at least if I'm interpreting what we both were just saying is the right way to do it, it requires you to be very strategic and structured about saying, well, here's the pain points, here's the customer segments. Messaging is very downstream of all that. So you've got to make sure you go upstream, talk about that stuff and get back to it.
Yeah, that's the thing I think that a lot of both non-marketers or even non-product marketers forget along the way, is that most product marketing documents, the copy is horrible, right? Because it's the raw primitives of what we're trying to get to. You would never probably publish that stuff, but it is the raw ingredients to create the more compelling, pithy taglines along the way. And so it's the science of developing a message that I personally find really intriguing.
So the last thing I'll say on this question, because we're on messaging and talking about it, and you just made that point about the pithy tagline versus the nitty gritty building blocks that go into getting that. Are you familiar with the company Coda?
Yeah, I know Coda really well.
Okay, so that, I don't know if it's still on their homepage, but that tagline they put up a little bit that shows like a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, old school style. And if you know what Coda is and their pitch of integrated docs and all this stuff, and the tagline was just enough of this sheet. The first time I saw it, I was like, that's one of the best marketing taglines I've seen in a sort of nerdy tech product for a long time. But I was like, you look at it and you're like, you know exactly what that's talking about if you're one of their target users.
Yeah, that is a good one. And Evan Davies and his team over there have done an awesome job at turning a collaboration tool into a little bit of a personality statement.
It's not like
the messaging documents behind that are kind of my favorite example of that. It's kind of a famous one, but it's Slack. And it was probably 4 or 5 years ago before it really blew up. They had these hero images. And the great part, it was literally their messaging framework, but it was a messaging app for people who underscore. And the best one was a messaging app for people who put robots on Mars. And it was digging into the, not Pathfinder, that makes me really old, but the rover. And it's like, oh, I get it. What does it do? Who is it for? What do they do with it?
Cool. Awesome. Great. So let's jump into the second question, which is, I want you to tell me a little bit about what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see candidates make in product marketing interviews, and give us some sort of the common ones so that some folks listening to this, if they're going through the process, know what sort of pitfalls to avoid.
And again, a bit of a philosophy intro is through this in the back of my head. It's hard as a candidate, as an interviewee coming in worried about the mistakes you're going to make. If you feel you're in an interview like that and people are trying to zing you or gotcha you or look for mistakes, you're probably interviewing with the wrong company or maybe at least the wrong team. That's a cultural problem because so much of product marketing is testing and trying and asking and trying to understand. Often we are called onto your previous point about that great tagline with that Coda. There was a lot of failure before you got there. And if we're expected to just magically have the answer, we're doomed. And so some of that is a great product marketing interview should feel like a conversation where you're getting closer and closer to a point as opposed to like a rapid fire questions. But in that context, some of the things that can be a challenge, 2 pet peeves that I'll touch on, and then we can talk to some other challenges. One is showing up with prepared answers, kind of stock rote, not like you're reading off a sheet, but you've over prepared for the interview because you don't really know what you're walking into. And it indicates perhaps you're going to walk in with a fixed mindset or playbook. The other one is when I do a debrief with my team afterwards, if I hear the exact same example used and I hear it from 3 or 4 people on my team, I start to worry about depth and curiosity. So I would say when you are preparing for an interview, know your story, know who you are and your point of view, but try to be in the moment of the conversation and really think through what the person is trying to ask you and have multiple examples. Have one great example you can talk to per interviewer that you're expecting to speak to. One, you will feel more prepared because if your one example doesn't meet the question, you have something to back, you have something to fall back on. It gives you a little bit more confidence. And then my other one, and maybe this is a personal one because I know it's very common advice, but it always hits me wrong because it shows a lack of awareness of how the process works, is asking for specific feedback. Do you think I'd be a good candidate for this job at the end? One, that's the wrong time to ask that question. Your interviewer is catching up on notes. They are trying to make sure that they covered everything that they needed to. And most of the times in a well-structured product marketing interview, every person has a specific area that they're focused on. So they can't provide you that answer because they don't have the whole context. The better thing to do with that is ask after and only ask the hiring manager because you'll actually get better feedback in that situation. And it's a more appropriate time to do it. Beyond that, the true mistake that I see people make is not asking clarification questions or follow-ups. Really great product marketers love the discovery part of the process, whether it's sales discovery when they're riding alongside on a sales call, or as they're working with a customer and trying to understand more and missing the opportunity to show the skill of, I'm going to answer your question, I'm going to provide some context, and then I'm going to take the conversation in the direction I want to go. It's something I'm always looking for to happen in the conversation, but not asking clarifications means you may miss the question. You may miss critical details, or you might be missing an opportunity to demonstrate a critical skill that you might have.
Demonstrating intellectual curiosity. I agree. Those are all good ones. I'm in like violent or 100% agreement with you on that second one about asking for feedback on the spot. It's tough because the intention is good, demonstrating that they're at least open to feedback and how'd I do and that type of stuff. But the big red flag of that is it demonstrates a real lack of situational awareness. And in some ways at that point are flipping the interview, and you are sort of putting that person on the spot and asking them to do something potentially very uncomfortable if you performed not so well, which the person won't want to do it. And two, if you sort of get them to do it, it may make an even worse impression on them. That person will be, this is the person that sort of put me on the spot at the end of it and whatnot.
And it's such a challenging thing to navigate, particularly as an interviewee, as a candidate, particularly if you're earlier in your career, because if you haven't seen enough of these cycles, you don't know what a great process looks like. And so a couple signals to look for as you're interviewing. So one, if you're asking that question, you're going to put your interviewer on the defensive a little bit, and it's tough. But I believe that a great interview process and a great candidate experience includes feedback to the candidate at some point. So if you are a candidate for a team, and as you're going through the process, whether it's after the first phone screen with the hiring manager or after you've been through that round of interview, that panel, if there isn't a touch point where, moving forward or not, you're not getting some feedback from the hiring manager, or in some cases the recruiter, that's specific to the conversation that you've had, that's a big, at least yellow flag that something might be off in the process. I personally, after a phone screen, have a rubric that I go through. If it doesn't go well, you're going to get a specific personal email from me explaining what we're doing and where we're going from there. If you've taken the time to spend 2 or 3 hours with my team, you're getting a phone call from me. We're going to talk about either why we're moving you forward or why not, and perhaps some of the things that I saw that you could learn from. That's the right time, but that's also a good signal that you've at least found a team with a strong culture to it.
Yeah. It's great that you do that. The unfortunate reality is probably 50-50 at best. I would say that companies are empathetic and responsive to the candidates. The other thing I'll echo, and then we'll move on to the next question that you mentioned, is important, is that while asking a person on the spot for feedback right during the end of an interview is not, in my opinion, at least, not the way to go. It sounds like yours as well. The recruiter for sure is often like your ally in this process. It's your person to go to for some of the tougher questions that may put an individual on the spot, but as part of his or her job. What are these interviews going to test you on? Talking about some of the compensation, that type of stuff. The recruiter is your ally, and they're also usually aligned with you once you're in the process. They want you to get the job too. It's part of their job that you get the job. Your incentives are aligned there, using your recruiter for some of that type of stuff.
Yeah, I think too that sometimes people miss or forget that. What are people's incentives in the conversation? That's great when you're talking to a customer in sales. Recruiters generally, right? They're going to be comped on filling roles.
Yeah, exactly.
And candidate experience.
Yeah.
Use that. They're truly on your side. There's
a good Charlie Munger quote, the Buffett partner, who said, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." And your recruiter wants you to get the job. So use that resource. Cool. Let's move on to the next question. I'd love to just talk a little bit about when you think about a product marketing interview process. And what I mean by that is, as you mentioned, a well-run process will have a series of interviewers. Each of them should be testing, again, in a well-run process, right? Should be testing you probably on a specific skill or maybe a handful of skills. And then that group is going to get together. They're going to do a discussion about how you did, and they're going to talk about all these different areas. What are those key areas for you in a product marketing panel? What are the things that when your team gets together at the end of the day, like if you don't have a read on X, Y, and Z skills, we failed as interviewers because we should know how they stack up on these skills.
Yep. So my answers here are going to skew towards the enterprise product marketing side of things. There's this broad spectrum of product marketing, consumer, SMB, more on the enterprise side. But when I'm thinking that if I have 4 people I'm going to put into a panel, I'm definitely digging into where we started the conversation today around structured thinking and positioning. So I'll have someone go deeper into a messaging framework, a launch, and think, how did you structure, execute that, and why? And dig into that. When it comes to soft skills, I'll usually have someone kind of dig into this curiosity. How did questions along the lines like, what kinds of different products have you worked on? How did you go about learning your current product? Right? What did that take? How did you approach that? What's something that you're particularly interested in now? Because so much of the role is constantly learning and keeping up with what's changing. And if you don't understand, for example, what's happening now and 12 months from now in the world of networking and connectivity, you're not going to be ahead of the game in terms of where that's going. You can't tell a compelling story. The next one in an enterprise setting is working with sales. So how have you worked with sales in the past? What's your relationship with sales? How do you talk to and work with customers? How have you enabled them in the past, and how do you get engaged in that process? And that's also a good time in that context to talk about metrics. Most of the shared metrics in enterprise product marketing partner with sales. They're both that magical but frustrating combination of quantitative and qualitative. My favorite one is qualified pipeline. And again, back to candidate mistakes. If I don't hear you talking at some point about your metric and where and how, that's a challenge. But I love qualified pipeline because it's quantitative in dollars and easily measurable. And it's also qualitative because it means someone else besides you has said whether or not those dollars exist, which is really, really nice. I think those are probably the primary ones, and there'll probably some situational specifics to the outcomes that I want for the job that will point at it.
So structured thinking, demonstrated curiosity, ability to probe, ask good questions, follow up, and third, some sort of proven ability or understanding of how to work with sales and enable sales. On the third one, going back to a similar follow-up question I asked you, one of the prior questions, if someone's new to the role, say they haven't been a product marketer before, say they did consumer PMM work where they don't have a sales team, and how would you try and assess, is this person, they haven't done it before, are they capable of doing it in our organization and working with sales?
There's a couple ways. There's a specific example of a candidate and a hire that I made that actually fits that profile really, really well. But one, there's always a salesperson somewhere.
Okay.
Even if you're 100%, if you are a digitally native vertical brand and you're going direct to consumer, there's someone who acts like a salesperson.
Okay.
Somewhere.
As a salesperson somewhere.
You have to get money somehow.
Building and selling at the end of the day.
The story that I have, this was back at a startup in the security space. We had about 50 employees at the time, and we were hiring our second product marketer. And we're interviewing this candidate, and she was coming from the world of video media. So the product was ultimately an advertising and content product. But as we talked through the sales skills part of the interview, we're trying to understand how she was able to get out of the marketing team. She told a story about how she identified a inefficiency in how things were getting done and actually reached out to the team that was responsible for content partnerships and worked with them to rebuild their process for how they qualified opportunities. She didn't use these words, but basically she was fixing their qualification. She was improving the questions and ultimately equipped them with some tools that helped them find better partners or higher qualifying opportunities. Like, that's perfect. We're going to translate those skills over to enterprise. And since then, she spent a bunch of time at App Dynamics doing really technical product marketing, which is just swing. And now she's off with a leadership role at a fintech company.
Cool.
It's awesome to see that. But those are the kind of skills that translate. Where have you gotten out of the organization? Where have you gotten as close to the customer as possible? And how have you personally advanced not just that conversation, but scaled that out?
Great answer. And thanks for sharing the example. Examples like that always sort of bring it to life. So that's super helpful for candidates. We'll watch this and have some of those same gaps that you're trying to, how do I demonstrate that I've got that even though I haven't done that? Let's talk a little bit about sort of two questions to sort of round things out. Tell me if you are in the shoes of what we're just talking about. You're an aspiring product marketer.
Okay.
You haven't been one yet. Maybe you've been like customer success manager, maybe you're an FP&A, whatever the case may be. What are your most important tips for someone that's trying to break in for the first time? And it can be in the interview itself or how you just even get yourself in the interview pipeline. You're like, hey, product marketing sounds cool. I'm done with what I'm doing now. I want to make the switch. What are the top two things you would say? Hey, go do X and Y, start here, or learn this.
That's a really good question because I don't want to bias towards my own experience. My personal path into marketing and product marketing was through an internal shift.
Yeah, that's, I think, fairly common too.
I think because there are generally more opportunities for that. So say if you are currently at a large company, let's say a company with more than 500 employees,
yeah,
give or take, is where you could really start thinking through this. Is there may be an APM, an associate product marketing manager, or a product marketing manager close to what you're doing today. So as a first thing to do in that situation is reach out to the people on the team and for what I would think of as an informational interview. Ask them about the team. What are their objectives? What are they working on these days? What makes someone a good fit for their team. That way they at least know and are thinking of you, and you can start learning a little bit the lingo and the language. Second thing, I would go read actually some old books. There are some great ones out there that I will literally walk back over to my bookshelf and pull them off because they're really foundational for understanding how people think. You don't have to read them all.
What are the key ones?
There's the apocryphal holy text of product marketing, which is Jeff Moore, Crossing the Chasm. It's a little dated, but the ideas and the concepts that are in there, particularly for technology, it's a really well-structured book, and it's something I find I keep pulling from time and time again. Another really good one, particularly if you're going to be tightly aligned with an enterprise sales motion, is the Challenger Sale. So it is a sales book, but what's great about it is it will teach you how to think like a salesperson. Your secondary stakeholder in all of this is going to be delivering pipeline sales.
Yeah.
And so understanding potentially how they think, how you can change the conversation is a critical piece. And then getting outside of that, something that's fascinating is Dan Ariely, Predictably Irrational.
Yeah.
Great way to just think about how people think and how they're going to perceive what you are saying is really, really key.
Yeah.
And so that's on the preparation side. As you are preparing, if you get to the point then where someone's, let's talk product marketing, let me see where you're going. What I would really focus on, make yourself a set of notes or force yourself to think through the exercise. For the role that I have now, what is the product or the technology that I'm working with? Who is the customer of that, whether I'm working with them directly or not? And ask yourself, if I'm that customer, what problem does my product solve for that customer? Having that frame and being able to speak to that from your experience, even if you've never done it before, it will show that not just a growth mindset is a little bit of an overused term. Show your willingness to look at a problem from different facets and grow outside of your current role. It will help you understand, is this interesting to me? Do I like thinking this way? And then to show some of those raw skills to the hiring manager who might be looking for a diamond in the rough here and there.
Awesome. Great answer. Cool. So one last question for you, and then we'll wrap up here. Product marketing, popular role these days. I think lots of folks want to get into it. There's limited roles. So you could be a great candidate. You could do a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about throughout this interview, demonstrate a bunch of great skills, and still not, maybe just don't quite get there because there's 5 or 6 other good candidates or whatever the case may be. So what last pieces of advice would you have for just going above and beyond, standing out? Once you're in the interview process, what can you do to really set yourself apart so that at the end of the day, you're the person who gets the offer call versus not?
And then you're playing for 2 things in that scenario. If you're really trying to break in, you're at the valley, at least in tech, there's a supply and demand imbalance. From what I'm seeing, there are more jobs available for product marketing than there are product marketers to fill them. So
good opportunity.
It's a great opportunity. I probably shoot myself in the foot here a little bit, but it is a candidate market, at least in product marketing. Right. And so there are probably some great opportunities out there to find some great teams, and that alignment is key. But the people who really stand out in interviews to me, they tend to do a couple of different things. They ask really thoughtful questions about the situation they're walking into. So ask about who buys the product and what they care about, because you can't know that necessarily from the outside, and don't assume, but ask. And you can pause this like, hey, I observed XYZ from your website, from the materials that you shared. Who's really the buyer you're trying to get to? I want to make sure I understand that correctly. What are some of the challenges that you face getting to that customer? You're asking about the problem that you can come solve. So it's like the jobs to be done version for product marketing. What's the problem you need me to solve? That's a great one. And then the one thing that I find that really, really helps in the conversation, and people don't do it enough anymore, so maybe a little old school, but not just a generic thank you message. Send something, like an interview is a sales process. You are trying to find a fit between a buyer, who's the hiring manager, and the seller, who's you, and you want to suss out that fit one way. You don't want to sell to everybody, but being able to come back in, and it's not like reiterating your cover letter, but like, hey, really enjoyed this part of the conversation. It got me thinking about these other 3 things. That's awesome. It shows me you're engaged in the process. It shows me that you're taking some time to process what you learned and synthesize it back. And those are always the people that I'm going to want to, at a bare minimum, give my best feedback to. Worst case, And best case, like, all right, well, let's see what else I can do if I give them more information along the way.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I think a thank you note, which I feel like it's interesting because there's people in both camps. It's a waste of time, don't do it. The people are like, yeah, I think it's worth it, do it. My sort of take on it is that if you're doing it just to write the thank you note, it's not going to change things one way or the other. You're going to send a generic thank you note and actually maybe sometimes make a difference on the margins of what you're talking about. Like someone writes a really thoughtful thing. And one thing that I've seen work well when I get notes like this, I take notes, someone uses that as a last chance to deliver some value. Like, hey, I remember we spoke about X and I actually just saw this interesting piece of research. Have you seen it? Thought it might be useful. Wow, this person's already sort of helping. And again, to your point, they're engaged in that process and that can make a big difference. Well, that's a very relevant place to end the conversation. Thank you for providing all of these insights. I think tons of good takeaways for folks going through the product marketing interview process, whether they're brand new to the role, trying to break in for the first time, or they are experienced, seasoned, and just trying to structure their story and succeed in the interview. So thank you for taking the time, Grant.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me on.
Awesome. This podcast is produced by ShareBird, the peer mentoring platform for product marketers. It is the place to discover on-demand resources to help you with your product marketing. To view past episodes, go to sharebird.com. And if you're preparing for product marketing interviews, check out Rocketblock's product marketing interview prep tools, the best place to practice PMM interview skills and get live coaching to ace your PMM interviews. Visit us at rocketblocks.me.